Education is a right in a society where degrees are often a requirement for you to get a job with minimum wage. The problem then is with the existence of these cash grab programs, education is once again made easier for the privileged and made harder for those who aren't. So proud to propose. Before I get into my substantive, 3 points of setup. Firstly, on cash cow programs, I think it's just general things that are already said in the context slide, like summer schools and certain degrees or non-degree programs that is established solely to generate revenue. But B, I think establishment that we are regretting inside of this motion, I think it's everything from the beginning existence of these programs made by, like, for example, credible universities like USC that were made to gain more profit for the university so that they can run. But also, I think we'd also like to note how it's also the prevalence of it is in society now, how there are many universities or institutions that have been created solely to make money. That is what we are regretting. But secondly, on status quo, what does it even look like? I think A, the fact that to get a job you need a minimum of a bachelor's degree. But B, education is unaffordable for many layers of society. C, a lot of universities are profit-centered. They want as much money they can get, so therefore they lack empathy for those who cannot afford the education itself. But thirdly, on counterfactual, I think two things here. A, universities have to find other ways to gain more money if these kind of cash cow programs never existed in the first place. I think that this will lead into like a more incentive for them to find other ways, such as like making their own businesses, for example, or actually asking the government for scholarships, for example. I think that there's going to be much more incentive for the society to actually care about the prices on-side opposition, on-side government. I'll prove this inside of my arguments. Firstly, on the capitalization of education. I think the problem in status quo is that cash grabs making universities overly profit-based, right? The thesis of this claim is that cash cow programs have a big play in the cause of why education has become so capitalistic in the first place. But why do cash cow programs become so prevalent to the point where they have made universities so capitalistic? Two reasons. A, they need more money because governments aren't funding them enough, for example. So these universities know that there is a big demand for people to pay for their things or for people to get a degree in the first place so that they can get jobs. Therefore, they need to handle more people, meaning that they need more money, right? But B, the realization of these institutions that they can just make money by giving easier chances for the rich. Instead of protesting and creating programs that are accessible and good, they focus more on creating programs that can give the money because they just want to still be able to run as an institution, right? The impact then is two things. A, what happens when these universities are greedy? They want more, right? This looks like increasing tuition for already existing programs, ignoring the poor who, for example, would also like to study these fields but cannot due to the prices. For example, they started one cash grab program just because they needed a little bit more revenue, but they realized there's enough demand for it and people are willing to pay such a big price, who are the rich, so they make more of these programs in the first place. But how can we say that they'll even increase tuition for existing programs that are right now, that were previously more accessible for the lower income families, right? Because of the fact that they know that people are willing to pay such big prices, they can just make some of the lower prices to mid prices so that they can gain more profit in the end. But they do not realize that once they're doing that, they're also cutting off the lower income families who still need this education. Note that these universities would not care that some people cannot access these things because it's more profitable for them to have expensive tuition for 10 students than it is for them to have 100 low paying tuition students, because of course 10 students means lower maintenance, right? But also because of the fact that the tuition is so big, they still get the same amount of money. It's better for them. In the end, they will not empathize with the low income families. But B, a lot of institutions just ignore credibility of their institutions now. Because competition is so high between top universities, they can just result into these cash grabbing ways because they think that at least we can make money with our institutions, right? Tertiary is no longer for learning, but it becomes something to get a job, right? So this proves to you that education loses its meaning towards money, right? Because of the fact that some institutions just become solely to create or get money from these people so that they can actually like gain more profit in the end. That is going to be bad. The comparative here is that one, when cash grabbing never existed, universities are not centered on gaining as much money as possible. They're going to have to look for alternatives, for example. They're going to protest to governments, for example, to like actually make people have decent enough jobs so that they can pay for university, for example. And they're going to be working together with like certain institutions like banks, for example, to help them expand instead of trying to gain money from the people or the society that is vulnerable, right? But secondly, they'll be more wise in their decisions when using the money that they've gotten because they know that it is limited. When they know that they cannot simply just get money from the the society, they will be more careful when they're using it, right? Meaning that the whole idea of like universities that try to buy things so that they can make their marketing of the university better is not going to happen on our side. People are going to be more careful. For example, when buying certain infrastructures, they need to know if it's actually going to be beneficial for the students instead of just thinking this will make their university look better, for example. But 3, there's going to be no scammy cash grabs targeting middle class families. This actually will be elaborated further inside of my second argument on accessibility and the poor. The problem is that lower income families cannot afford this education, but it's become a requirement to get jobs, right? The thesis of this claim is that cash grabs enhance the gap of accessibility. Education is already easier for those who have money, but these programs make it even easier and will make it harder for the poor. How do cash cow programs make the poor even more vulnerable? 2 things. 1, the poor have to work harder to get a degree. The rich can just pay for these degrees in top universities and get a decent job. But secondly, when it is not the rich who are getting these degrees, then it's the poor who have been tricked into the expensive institutions with low credibility. What do we mean by this, and why is this true? A, the underprivileged usually lack education and understanding of credibility of certain education institutions. They know that in society in society they need a degree to survive, then they'll just try to find a degree in any kind of way. They lack education on like actually choosing the right ones, right? But B, they're so desperate for a decent job that getting into top universities, and they know that getting into top universities where most students are getting paid tutors to study for is so hard already. They end up thinking that paying a decent amount will be better since there's no risk of no acceptance. For example, how in middle class families where the children are not maybe that excelling in academics, they're going to think that, these cash grab institutions that already exist will give them a degree and that means that they can get a job, but they don't realize that this university is not even credible enough for them to even get a job. Later on, they're going to get tricked because of these cash grabbing institutions. But C, the rich will most likely be the ones in the actually good and credible cash grab institutions, because obviously they're the ones who can pay that big amount. Because I think that we've already characterized from the start, cash grabs are not only just going to be the good institutions that make these cash grabbing just so that they can gain profit, but also the fact that there's going to be more cash grabbing institutions that might not also be that good, but are only solely existing so that they can get people to join their programs and get money, right? Which means even if revenue is needed for better facilities or other things, at least if opposition wants to say we're only taking from the rich, we've disproved this whole idea with this argument. 3 impacts then. First, it's so easy for the rich to get education, easier for them to get decent jobs. But secondly, less likely for governments to provide things like scholarships because they believe that institutions can make enough money to lower tuitions and their own scholarships independently, so they're not going to care about the layers of society that can't pay for it. But see, the cycle of poverty continues. This is going to be so bad for the lower income families who cannot even afford education, and it's going to be harder for them to get jobs later on, and they're also going to get tricked into the cash grabbing institutions that exist in countries like Indonesia. The comparative is, on our side, the idea of buying a degree is not as bad. Even if institutions still are profit based to a certain extent, it's not going to be as bad as it is in opposition. Secondly, no scammy cash grabs targeting middle class families or institutions that are solely made to gain money. 3, things like governments helping universities to be accessible will be more likely to happen because they don't think that universities have to be independent and make their own money. We want to protect the most vulnerable. We want to protect the meaning of education in and of itself. So proud to propose.